morning for most of the folks who are tuning in from India, who are checking this out. There's a very special reason I wanted to do this in LinkedIn of all places, because that's where most of the center of gravity of work, happens. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with you, Paul. Uh, Thank you for taking the time and joining this podcast, video recording, whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Venky. Excited to be here. Good morning, India. Good night, America. Other countries are sleeping.
Great. So I must share, uh, I think uh, when Venkatesh, I've been following Venkatesh Rao for a very, very long time. And, his blogs have been sort of my spiritual cave in some sense, right? In terms of trying to figure out various doing in my life. And when the Art of Jig was closing in, and I was a subscriber of the Art of Jig, and at that time he started referencing a lot of your work. And as I started to to really discover your work, obviously the first pull was the phrase called Pathless Path. So I really am excited to go delve deep into all of this, but let me start with uh, a question that often rattles, and at the same time a question that oftentimes is also a moment of an awakening every time whenever this question gets asked. It's a simple question of what do you do?
And of what? What it
What
means?
do you do? What do you do? Yeah, I mean,
Oh, what do I do? A lot of stuff. I think. I mean, as you were mentioning before, I'm a member of the gig economy. Um, I left a full time job about 5 years ago to ostensibly become a freelancer. Along the way, I kind of stumbled upon many things I like doing. Writing, freelance consulting, creating things online, experimenting in the creator economy, and most recently writing a book. So, yeah, I do a lot of stuff. And I think the lens I look at that question is much broader than it was before, which was work or what do you do is something you do for money.
mm. and and I think that's where the attraction of the pathless path actually comes in some sense, because it's almost impossible to really talk about the entire gamut of what we do. And I have a very, very special enduring relationship with this phrase. uh, and like in your book, which is the pathless path, you really beautifully nail down it into as a mode of being, right? So before I really go into this, let me start off with one question that I wanted to approach this in terms of writing the book, right? Because you said that now, right now, after the book is another, probably, for you. I'm presuming it's another milestone which could really take you off in another direction, whole new, which is probably very different from what you've imagined. Uh,
Yeah, I don't know what comes next. I think I've really tried to lean against planning for the future.
mhm.
Like I want to get that next job or this amount of money or that house or something or this milestone, and really try to just live in the journey, live in the moment. So my book was emergent over, like, I just was writing because I liked writing, and then I kept writing. People would reach out to me, I would get feedback. People were telling me the writing was meaningful to them. Eventually, I had so much stuff that I kind of had to write a book to make sense of it all for myself and for other people. And I wanted to continue to get better at writing. So I'm still more or less on that same journey. I've
Mhm.
just happened to publish a book along the way. I think writing is something that's very important to me. Um, right now, I'm doing a little more consulting right now just because I'm back in the US and I need to pay the bills here. It's an expensive place to live. Um, but always trying to do that by giving myself space to kind of write and create and do the things that give me the energy to kind of like stay motivated and stay on this path.
Great. So, since you're talking about writing here, maybe let me start with this question. See, there are two kinds of nonfiction books that we are very used to, right? Uh, you know, in another conception, if somebody talks about, say, let's say the Pathless Path, right? You could go the Malcolm Gladwell way, right? Where
Hmm.
you start off with a very captivating story about some people, and then you could, you could tell these various stories together and then insert some data points. I mean, and you could also insert some nice concepts from sociology, you also, which we've done also in this book, right?
Yeah.
And talk about it purely from an outside in perspective. What really endears me, and of course, I mean, if you're a typical consultant, you might also come up with a nice formula that says that this is how you go and do the pathless path.
Yeah.
What really endears me to your book is the fact that you don't do that. You almost bear yourself open with a lot of candor that really blew my mind. And it's almost like you're pulling the veins from your noodles, it's pulling your veins in, and examining in what it is to the uncertainty of walking in a path that it's almost like driving in the night, but you just have the light that covers shows you for 10 meters ahead, and you can't just see beyond that, and you are driving in a certain way. What gave you the confidence to write this kind of book rather than the other kind of book?
I don't know. I think um, maybe naiveness. I wouldn't call it confidence. I went into it kind of thinking I would do a collection of essays and like put some common threads between my writing. I think what I discovered in the first couple of months is that there was a deeper, more personal story to tell. I think early on I had the idea that I would tell this like, oh, here's a how-to guide.
Mm,
But I realized along the way I don't really like those books. I liked them when I was younger, but I don't like them now, and I didn't want to write one. It wouldn't have been fun. Um, so I kind of just wrote the book I wanted, which is I just want to feel what it's like to be on someone's journey, right? So, and then I think in writing the book, I challenged myself to kind of go full out, just put my heart into it, let it rip, like just go deep and like put it all on the page. Um, and I think I kind of figured out how to do that.
mm,
So in a sense, it's the only kind of story I could and knew how to tell.
mm.
Uh, I mean, there's a lot of people when they're trying to write a book, they look at what other successful books do and they want to try and fit into that mold. I wanted, I didn't, I kind of leaned against that on purpose. It just wouldn't have been all that fun for me. I didn't want to try to compete with Malcolm Gladwell. I wanted to try to become more of what I was capable of becoming. And that was like the only possible best book I could write, I think.
No,
And
and
maybe
it's
that's why it's resonating. It's
yeah,
actually
yeah.
surprised me. I had no idea that it would resonate as much as it has with people.
And yes, I mean that's the whole thing, uh, I in what ways that I could imagine somebody like you, and your lives have been different, my lives have been different. I was born in Chennai, you were born in Connecticut, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in what ways could one imagine? I mean that was a beauty for me when I finished the book, and there that despite the fact that we're born in two different countries, our lives have been very similar. And that is a very profound realization in some sense, that no matter what the cultural moorings, and no matter what different lives, different contexts, different political systems, and whatever what, and there is a certain sense of the the rhythms of our life, right, in the way it has flowed in, right, and the ways in which the ways in which we've all attempted to discover work. I love that phrase in your book. You talk about copy pasting what the parents did, right? I tried to copy paste what my cousin did. My cousin went for, in India there's this Ivy League colleges called
Yeah.
IIMs. They are
Yeah,
the
I know
Indian
them.
Institute of Management. So my cousin was these one of those star a cousin, who went to the Ivy League, and I thought I should copy paste what he's doing. And now I have 10 years later, I'm realizing, it's a path that it's completely of my own making, and I have to discover this pathless path.
Yeah, we live in weird times. So I think on the first aspect, in terms of common stories, right? I think the human experience is way more common than I realized. And this is something I've realized through writing. I've been writing online for years. And especially the past 3 to 4 years, I've talked with people each week from around the world about their relationship with work. And there's a certain kind of person that the default script just doesn't work for them. And that person is just hungry for different paths, different ideas, other people like them that are confused. And I'm really only writing for those people. And I think figuring that out was really powerful for me. A lot of people get caught up in kind of the memes or political ideas of their country, right? You shouldn't write about this because X. You shouldn't write about this because Y. I think that just keeps people from sharing their story. We need more stories, not less, right? And things like self publishing mean almost everyone can share their story. Nothing's stopping you from publishing now, right? Whereas our parents, they actually had real constraints. Neither of them could publish books at our age. They
Yeah.
just couldn't. They weren't allowed. I mean, maybe your parents had access to a publisher or something, but mine certainly didn't. We weren't born into the right kind of family to like access those kind of things. Um, so that's all changing, right? And I think what I'm trying to lean into is what are the possibilities of the new paths that have emerged? What are the possibilities of the internet? What are the possibilities of our lives, given that in many countries, the current generation is actually substantially wealthier than the previous generations. Now, we can have a whole conversation about like, have people just taken that increased wealth and raised their expectations about their quality of life?
Mm,
Um, but the reality is like people will talk to me, hey, you can go be a nomad because you're American.
mm,
It's like, well, I'm in these nomad countries and there's like no Americans there because Americans don't take vacations. And I'm meeting people from all these different countries. I'm meeting like nomads from India and people from Thailand and Indonesia. And it's really amazing how many people are taking different paths and the amount of possibilities for people these days. So it's really trying to make sense of all that. And what does it mean for how we think about work?
yeah, and in a way, uh, I think our parents' generation. I mean, in India, most of them were reeling from the effects of colonization, right? My
Right.
parents' generation, they were almost, you know, in India at least, in those who were born in the 50s. My parents were born in 50s. I was a child of a late marriage, so my parents were born in the 50s, and for them, the question of livelihood was paramount, right? It was a question of
Right.
how do I earn a bread to the table? How do I earn food on the table? And
Right. And
and
that's
and
real.
yeah, that's the only thing challenge. And I guess for somebody like you and me who were born in the 80s, uh, we've been in a certain kind of a phase where, I mean, 85 is this phase where we had a foot in the older ways, and at the same time we were also having another foot in the new one. I mean, it's what I don't know, this author called Sam, I'm forgetting his name, Chris Harris. He talks about those who were born in the 1985, where this in
Hmm.
between generation, right, who still have a conception of the life before the internet, and
So
who
true.
also see the life of the possibilities that exist in the internet.
Yeah. I started my career working for a manufacturing company, um, making aircraft engines, right? And I did like operations and worked in industrial manufacturing. Um, Now I make money exclusively working on the internet remotely anywhere in the world. It's dramatic shift. And I think a lot of people in our like age group actually haven't caught up with this. A lot of people are struggling.
mm,
in the US, where it's like everything's like there are a lot of people that have kind of followed the default path, whether it be like good engineering school in India or like trying to get a good business job in the US. They've like done well on that for 10 years, but like the future is increasingly uncertain and unstable and fractionalized, and like learning is higher demand. People don't know how to like relate to that.
mm.
Um, so I think I'm also trying to write for those people too, just to make them feel more comfortable on their paths. But I mean, my book probably resonates more with the people that are already on an uncertain path.
Yeah, and I think that's where, the, like, I mean, you rightly said, we need those stories to come out of those who are on the path. And that's where, for me, I relate to your book as as these, I mean, I'm a big fan of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, right? And I'm
Yeah, his
currently in
book
the
is.
middle. Yeah,
I would just skip my book and read his. Like he's a genius.
yeah,
But
yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
yeah, I'm saying that's the nonfiction book I'm not capable of writing anyway, right? He's just so brilliant and is able to bring alive like what we're really after in life through stories and myths. Um, and I'm just doing the copycat version of that and writing my own personal twist on it.
No, I think you deserve much far more credits than that, because I think what you've done in this is, I mean, what I really loved is you've also created this constellation of these various people whom we discover in the online world, right? And by
Yeah,
bringing all of these stories together, I mean, you talk about almost all most of the guys that I've been really fascinated with: K. High, Daniel Vasallo. You talk about Michael Ashcroft. I mean, all those guys who are all in their own weird idiosyncratic parts, and of course Venkatesh Rao, who's my favorite. And you talk about all of these lives together in a certain way and bring them all to almost at, I mean, you don't use the word heroic journey in some sense, but a hero's journey in some sense. But in an essence, I think what you're pointing out is that the old stories that our parents' generation and we are still inherited and still carrying as legacy baggage, right?
yeah.
Is probably is no longer relevant, right? And it's now high time that this current generation discover their own hero's journey.
Yeah, I mean, it's still relevant. The default path works incredibly well for
Hmm.
some people. I think for me, it's just knowing what game are you playing
Mm,
and then what are the trade-offs you're willing to make. I
mm,
think especially in the US, like being able to work like a very middle class job and have a very comfortable life is not as easy anymore,
mm,
especially with the increased expectations, right? So a lot of people are actually playing a much harder game, although they're still running the script of that very older path.
mm.
But they have more stressful jobs. Their spouse is working. They have their life is just filled with busyness.
Especially after the pandemic,
Um,
yeah.
so it's really okay. What are the trade offs I'm incurring here? Is it worth it? And then if not, what do I actually really want? And that that's really the gateway to the pathless path, as I put it.
Yeah, and thank you for actually, pointing out that the default path still works, right? I mean, it
Oh
can be
yeah,
sometimes deceiving to imagine that your little world is the world. So yeah, and
yeah.
I
I
think,
mean, it works better than ever. I think right in a place like India, it's such a path to prosperity now that people are losing interest in it because it's too predictable, right?
mm,
Um, but I think at the core of it, like what people are realizing with more options for working in many different ways is that people don't just want security and stability.
mm,
When given the option, they want to work on things that matter to them and they want to do it on their own terms.
mm, mm,
And increasingly, more and more people are taking that option and, like me, doing it at cost to an alternative path I could be on. I could be making a lot more money and people would respect me more if I was still a strategy consultant.
mm,
But the people that would be respecting me, I wouldn't be seeking that respect.
mm.
I get more fired up connecting with people like you, and I've realized that that makes my life a little more fun, and that's why I kind of stay on this path.
Yeah, I mean, and I think you've almost come to a point where you've said that. I mean, I was following your Twitter the other day where you talked about how do I optimize for finding more interesting friends along the way. Now, how do I optimize my life for doing that more and more in more generative ways, right? So I think that's a very very interesting aspect. But I want to touch upon the previous point that you mentioned, right? In which is like, there are only some countries who can afford, or only Americans can afford, or very few people could afford this today. uh, you know in India, right? If anyone who has to typically say that, no man, I can't afford to do this, I have a job. There's this common phrase, right, that in Hindi they say is papi pet ka sawal. What it means is, it's my cursed, it's a question of my cursed stomach. I mean, in literal translation of that Hindi phrase, uh,
A cursed what?
the cursed stomach. It's a question of my
Ah,
cursed
cursed stomach.
stomach.
Yeah.
I mean, what it implies is I need to ensure that I feed for myself, and so I have to stick on to this job, right?
Ah,
So it's a
but
common
it's kind of like a
phrase.
dark nihilistic response, right? It's like,
Yeah, in some sense, but it's sounding a little more darker than the original in Hindi is. uh
yeah. I think what it gets to though is people are like not having something to do is terrifying. Whether we want to acknowledge it or not, we live in a society in which people judge others on their ability to contribute, right? And we use work, full time jobs, as a metric for contribution. And when people imagine living a life when they don't have a clear role,
mm,
they assume they'll be a terrible person or judged or mocked or left behind or loved less by family members. And that's really terrifying.
mm, mm,
So, a lot of what's behind people's fear of taking different paths is really the fear of like not being loved. And
yeah.
that's really hard. And I mean, my answer is to find a friend who's asking similar questions, doing similar things. Um, and to figure out what you're really after, right? And I think this is where things like taking a month off from work can be really powerful, because then you can get a little distance to realize, oh, I actually don't want to work on my own. I
Mm,
like working in a job, but I'm more conscious of the trade offs and the costs I'm willing to pay to make that happen.
mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, I've many times, whenever since few friends and few clients oftentimes ping me and ask me that, okay, you're doing all of this, are you trying to look for the next job? Is this like an in between phase?
Yeah,
Every people have this habit of asking, and of course, with a lot of love and care, right? Many times
right.
people ask this question, and also, I mean, the question of what love that you're mentioning is also interesting. For me, I can share this with all honesty. uh, I've been sitting with this thought for almost like for I mean, it took me almost about 9 years, 8 years before I could quit. And
Hmm.
one of the thing that happened, I mean, I started almost to work in about 2011, and by the time I quit a full-time job, and the idea of also working on a full-time job was in about 2019. And for me, the acceptance of my spouse, and in terms of what what how much they are comfortable with this whole idea, was a very key factor. So
Of
I
course.
totally resonate that that it takes time for your partners, for your life partners, to understand what you're trying to do, and see the value of what you're trying to do. I remember having this conversation with my wife. She once told me, I thought when you're going to quit job, you're going to just chill out. uh, and I mean, it is a little silly in some sense, but at the same time, it's very hard to really see how each of us, the loved ones around us, perceive these choices, right, and the decisions, and what it implies, and how they see, because each of us from different worlds, obviously, and they take time to kind of to resonate and warm up to this whole idea also.
Yeah. That's another people's fear too, is what would I do with my time if I didn't have my job, right? Well, it turns out if you take a few weeks off and recover from the low grade burnout, you have an explosion of ideas to work on. I have like infinite ideas of things I want to get involved in. Now, I don't get involved in all them because I want to stay on this journey and stay energized so I don't burn myself out. But there's no shortage of things I want to do on my own. The biggest challenge, though, was figuring out how to create my own work, do my own work, do things on my own. We're trained to think we need permission to do everything, or we need somebody telling us to do stuff. So we spend all our years in school having directions given to us, and then we go into the workplace and our managers tell us what to do. And when we try to be creative, they correct us and say, "Don't be creative. Do it like I want it in this way." Right? And you start to learn this is how you do work. This is how you do things in life. So then people say, "Well, what would I do?" It's like they've kind of lost touch with their creativity, their imagination, their sense of wonder. And that was really part of my journey. Is I left thinking I wanted to be a freelance consultant, but really I just wanted to escape. And what I really needed was to create space in my life such that I could start dreaming again, imagining again, finding the optimism inside me, finding things I was drawn to do, and doing those things and just committing to them.
Yeah, I mean, uh, I I too spent about 6 7 years in consulting world, and I think one of the pernicious uh, things that you kind of subliminally absorb is the whole idea that time is money.
Yeah, exactly. It's not.
It's
It's
not.
just time.
It's just time. And I mean, and that's a thing, right, like you rightly say, right, you talk about this thing in the book where you say that there's a default path Paul and there's a pathless path Paul. That
Yeah.
really resonated a lot, because I also get into this mode oftentimes, right, when I get into consulting, and I try to do other things, that there's almost this need to start measuring your value in terms of, okay, I mean, even though I've taken certain efforts in my life to unbundle time from money, right, but I think that connection is so visceral. I mean it's so attractive. It's almost like a charged current that sometimes can really draw you, like the eye of the Sauron.
Yeah, I still struggle with this too. Uh, I still feel the pressure to make money and fund my life. Um, I don't have the attachment to the numbers I was making before. I haven't come close yet in making what I made in my previous job. Um, and but I still feel the pressure to like monetize, right? And
Mm,
do those things. It's just that I found value in saying no to those things and
mm,
just waiting
mm,
and just like trusting my gut, creating space in my life for kind of serendipity to emerge. I'm somebody that naturally just looks to contribute, volunteer, help support each other. So opportunities kind of emerge out of that. But those things can take a long time,
mm,
right? So if you think like time is money and you start measuring yourself, oh, I need to monetize 20 hours a week, you can do that pretty easily. That's
mm,
actually way easier than people think. Like if you just want to become a freelancer and start monetizing your time, you can do that. It's pretty easy. The deeper challenge is how do you do that in a way where you can actually keep doing it over the long term? Because if
mm.
you don't like what you're doing, you'll burn out so fast. You burn out way faster on your own than you do in a job.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the struggle also comes in from the fact that uh, I mean, you mentioned this in the book, right, the manager inside your head. uh, I mean, I look at this oftentimes a lot. I mean, it's been more than 2 years. I've figured certain parts of cash flows there, so I'm relatively okay. But yes, I do go through months. I mean, when the second wave hit, my entire consulting work stopped because everyone was,
Yeah.
it was shitstorm in India in second wave, and so nobody was willing to pay for consultants. Uh, so and you know there are these moments, and obviously, right, when you only have to, I mean, the closest analogy I often think about is it's almost like surfing, right? I mean, although I don't do surfing so much, but it's what I've seen is that at least you have to constantly ride with the wave, and you have to go down and climb up, and sometimes you only have to reserve on you only have to hold, depend on your inner reserves to keep floating.
Yeah, for sure. It's working on your own is a completely different experience. And this is one of the things that shocked me is the experience of working in a full-time job and existing in that life is radically different for me at least than how I experience my life now. So before it starts with this assumption, okay, I have this work I do, it's these set hours. Work is a priority. If you have an extremely important project, you prioritize that above everything else. You cancel family stuff, right? Now I'm in charge.
Mm,
Um, so there's nobody to blame and say, oh, I have to work. I'm opting into every single trade off and choice,
mm,
right? And I can't kind of like disappear at work when I'm like low energy and things, right? Actually need to be motivated and energized. So the things I opt into are very important. I need to make sure it actually aligns with what I care about and what I'm good at and where I want to be growing. I can't just take any work because that might deplete my energy so much that like I'm going to lose all interest in writing. Writing's the thing that really gives me energy to keep going, and then it's like what am I even doing on this path? So it's really hard. And but I enjoy that challenge of figuring it out.
mm.
And a lot of people don't. So they just probably shouldn't take my path. But they can inject different experiments in their own and try to figure out better versions for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's great you mentioned the point about canceling family, right? I mean, I also grew up in a family where, I mean, you mentioned this in the book, right, how your father was sort of traveling and you wish you had more time.
Hmm.
He had more time for you, and the same was happened in my family where, oftentimes there's almost, at least in my parents, there's this sort of this understanding in a certain sense that, if there is work, it's okay to completely forget the family.
Yeah,
uh,
that's. I never liked that.
yeah,
I didn't want that. Like, I didn't buy that.
yeah,
And I'm just choosing to deprioritize work.
yeah, yeah. No, and I think today, I mean, that's where I mean, the metaphor I often try to think about is like earlier when we had, people talked about jobs, right? Jobs where these default. I mean, I remember this episode where, where this friend of mine told me this analogy. It's like jobs are like these cars that you get, right? And you, every time you choose different jobs, you're only trying to choose which cars do I go in, right? And when I really extend that analogy further, to me, setting out on a path of self-employment, or figuring out your own pathless path is really getting down to the nuts and bolts in terms of seeing what engine, what wheel do I want to use, and then this coming up with your own contraption that will just move along, that is
Well, I
suitably
think
sorted
it's
for your life.
I think it's an interesting analogy because I think I realized I wanted an e-bike. I didn't actually want a car.
Yeah, yeah,
Right?
yeah,
So it's my like on my previous path, I didn't even have a conception of any other life. So for me, it was I didn't even know what I didn't know. I wanted the e-bike, but I'm still trying to like optimize the next car and like, oh, the next car will make me happy.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
turns out I just wanted a different environment. I wanted to rewrite the whole script.
Yeah, and I wanted to walk down when I don't want to, when I don't want to bike as well.
Yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, I haven't owned a car in 7 years now.
Yeah, yeah. No, and the other aspect also in time. I mean, for me, one of the greatest things being on the on this path was, I mean, I almost quit job when we were pregnant with our child, first child, uh, and when I really look back at these last 2.5 to 3 years of being on this path, uh, I realized that one of the greatest things is it has helped me spend more time with my child,
Yeah,
uh,
that's
and and
priceless.
and that's priceless. I had this hypothesis in my head that when you whatever I've read, I was trying to read a lot of books about parenting and stuff like that, and I figured that the best time you could spend time with your child is in the first 4 years of your child. And afterwards starts to discover his own social life, and runs around. And and to in order to spend more time in his first 4 years of his life, I wanted an engine that will help me do my own work and do that, and I just couldn't have done this without this kind of an arrangement there. So I think, like, to your previous point about canceling family, this brings family in a much more integrated way, and you kind of walk along with your journey in this path. And I think that's another perks of doing the pathless path, that you just don't do it on your own, but you also bring your family along, and you bring your folks along, and kind of cruise in your own way, in your own pace, and do that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of my intention. I mean, me and my wife want kids, hopefully soon. And part of why I did this when I did is I knew, like, I didn't want to wait to meet somebody and then take a risk, right? I wanted to go build the life I wanted to build and then find people along the way. I met my wife along the way. But um, I want to be prepared such that I know I have options for flexibility when I do have kids. A lot of people say, "Oh, well, you can't do this if you had kids." But what they're saying behind that is layers and layers of stuff. First off, they're talking about their fear of uncertainty. And what they've done with their fear and uncertainty is told themselves a story that says, I need to work and make a lot of money because that's what responsible parents do for kids,
Mm,
right? I just choose different story and I'm willing to pay the price of not prioritizing money,
mm,
right? So I might have to compromise things I want or I could buy, but the time will be priceless. And I might be lighter, more engaged with the world, more alive. Um, yeah. And then the funny thing is, people that take unconventional paths, typically when they have kids, that's a trigger to commit even further to their unconventional path.
mm,
Whereas, like, what's really happening is too many people think they want to take an uncertain, unconventional path.
mhm,
Really, like, having kids makes you more of who you are, I think.
mm.
So if you're really afraid, you're probably going to get more afraid and like
Yeah.
double down on the stories you're telling yourself versus reevaluating them.
Yeah, I mean, I have this conspiracy theory that it was my child who really made sure that I quit my job, you know?
Yeah, I've had multiple people say this to me. I had a friend who his wife got pregnant, and then immediately he was like, I have to leave my job right now. I have like, I'm gonna like launch my business next week. And he just did it.
Yeah,
Um, I think there's a lot of people like that
yeah, yeah.
because it really focuses people on what they value.
Yeah, and I think a child in one's life, this has been my experience, in one's life, uh, makes you focus on the real fundamentals of what is life, you know. I mean, I wanted to experiment with natural pregnancy for my wife, so we chose a midwife, and I was through the entire process of labor. I was with her, but while we didn't opt for a typical hospital kind of an environment. We wanted an environment that was more home like, and so we opted for that kind of a process. And And I realized that at those moments when that life has its own ways of creating its path, uh,
Yeah.
and you discover that so profoundly in pregnancy, and it holds true in work as well.
Do you find there's more of a connection to this like spiritual stories in India? Like I think we've lost touch with some of the mythical like religious stories in the US for sure. And I know India's kind of absorbed some of the like hustle mentality of the US, but I mean if you read the stories like the Gita, um
Hmm.
like all none of what I'm talking about is new.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And yes, I mean, uh, see, in India, at least to a large extent, we are a half colonized country, right?
Yeah,
Which
true. So
means,
it's more you have the British sentiment.
yeah, we have both, right? I mean, in certain parts of work, we are happy to in parts of work we almost adopt a Protestant belief, right? I mean, I can see this in my
Yeah.
parents' life, right? And they almost live two different lives. There is this completely Indian religious life that is born from the tradition and the cultures, and then when they get to work, they completely transform into this Protestant idea of work, where work. I mean, you talk about that in your book, right?
Yeah.
We move this idea that work is divine, and it's a work that can take priority over anything. And I think from that, the next generation is we are trying to break out of that schism, right? That I don't want to have this artificial distinction between this Protestant working self and this religious cultural self, and in a way trying to I mean that's been my experiment as well, in a certain sense. Over the last 3 years, I've been part of a small group where we are studying Yoga Sutras, which is one of the uh,
Nice. Yeah, yeah.
which is a dense aphoristic treatise on psychology, and one of the most fascinating treatise on psychology, human psychology, that has ever been written, in my opinion. uh, and I've been studying that over the past 2 years now, slowly with a small group of friends. And we've been also studying a small part of this small community. We're trying to also understand some of these religious texts in today's context, right? Without simply just harking back to the past. And this has been the realization, in some sense, that this current generation, we are trying to break through that whole artificial separation we had of there is a certain way I will live, and there's a certain way my livelihood is. It's also, again, I mean, there's this almost somewhere I had written this, that this modernity creates this artificial distinction between life and livelihood. And I think books like yours, and whatever are this whole pathless path people who are exploring, is in a way to break that chasm, no?
Yeah, I think one of the big shifts that happened for me was thinking of work as something that's paid for in a job, right?
Mm,
We've had all these paths emerge because of economic and industrial success. But we've kind of forgotten that the majority of humans still don't make a living via
mm,
full time jobs. And this has only been a new experiment for like
mm,
100 years.
mm,
Right. And we've lost sight of like there are actually other things worth doing in the world. This goes back to your previous point of like valuing time as money,
mm,
right? But we just pretend this is the only life worth living while at the same time everyone's like taking care of their grandparents, like taking care of kids,
mm,
volunteering, contributing to society in other ways. These are all things that are valuable in the world.
mm,
Um, and if you lean into them, will you make less money and perhaps have less respect? Maybe,
mm.
but it also might be worth it. Like it might make your life better. And I think that's kind of the story I keep telling in my book.
Yeah, and I think I may want to maybe question the whole part of less money, but less money again comes from probably an assumption that there is a certain default money there. But probably the question comes in where life is, I mean, money is one of the factors in which you are prioritizing, and among other factors.
Yeah, I think it's worth being pragmatic about it.
Mm.
But if you're starting with this idea that like that ikigai diagram that everyone shares on the internet, it's
Yeah,
like the key to life is like combining what you love to do, what you can be paid for.
yeah,
It's nonsense.
yeah,
Like if you're starting with what you can be paid for, you're only looking at a very narrow way of living a life, right? I've made less than like $3,000 from my writing after costs and stuff in, I don't know, 6, 7 years. But to me, it's like that's the fuel for my life. I need to keep doing that. I love it. It's so much fun.
yeah,
Um, and it's really about, okay, that's work worth doing.
yeah,
How do
yeah.
I create the conditions given the current reality of how to make that happen?
Yeah, and it's so endearing to me that you also talk about Charles Eisenstein, somebody whom I deeply love and admire his writings. And I've been reading his stuff, almost all of his stuff for a very long time. I'm so thrilled that you wrote about sacred economics in his and
Yeah,
in
it's
your
a great
book.
book.
Yeah, yeah, and to me, I mean, it's what he also talks about, right? It's almost where you. Uh, you create the conditions for that, creating that kind of a generosity,
Right.
and nothing can be more rewarding than that.
Yeah. It's yeah, I mean, I think people don't realize how many like default stories they've just inherited from how the world works and realizing how negotiable those things are, right? People have this idea of, oh, if I have a lot of money, I'll give money to charities,
Hmm.
right? Inside of that script is saying, I don't trust giving money to anyone directly because what if they waste it?
Hmm.
Right? So I can be generous, but only in like institutionally defined ways.
Hmm.
Um, I've had a lot of fun in just experimenting with like giving money away to people.
Hmm.
And it's really uncomfortable on both sides. People don't like receiving money because they say, what do I owe you? Right.
Yeah,
Um, so what you realize is a lot of people like the money economy, the transaction economy, because they can kind of just operate without obligation.
hmm.
But the other side of that is if you do create obligations and bonds, you can actually like have a richer life. It might have more bumps in the road, but it might be more enjoyable.
Yeah, and I think the idea is in a certain sense much more than saying that the money economy is going to exist, right? And it is going to have certain parts of my life I have to deal with the money economy, and get the taxes done, get my monies right there. but
Yeah.
but I think you wake up, I mean, books like yours, or whatever, these kind of experiments, life experiments, wake you up from the stupor that this has to be the only economy.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so many different ways of operating in the world. And then if you go to different countries, there's so
Yeah,
many beliefs about money and how the world works. You realize that, oh wow, everyone's kind of growing up with their own embedded beliefs.
yeah,
And it's better to start with from first principles and figure out, okay, what are the trade-offs I'm willing to make? What are the systems I'm willing to design for myself that actually enable me to thrive?
yeah. I mean, for me, one of the very powerful realizations about money came in uh, when I actually discovered that in Indian religious thought there are these female goddesses who are called as Ashtalakshmis, and there were like eight female goddesses who were related to wealth.
Hmm.
So they were these embodiments of eight forms of wealth at the end of the day, right? And I realized that to access each of those eight other forms of wealth, I needed to have a life that could do that, those lab. I mean, I needed to create a lab in which I could experiment with these eight forms of wealth. And
Yeah. What are some of those?
I mean, Griha Lakshmi, it could the home in terms of land, in terms of food,
Ah,
in terms of relationships, being connected, and I mean, there's so many ways in which these
what's
wells there.
what's the most popular one?
People obviously talk about the most popular one is the one which throws coins at you.
Yeah,
It is always the
it's
reflection of
funny.
our times.
Yeah, I mean, you see that in Asian culture too. My wife's from Taiwan, and I spent a lot of time there. Like Chinese culture has the prosperity gods um, as well, and yeah, this is a very extreme literal focus or explicit focus on like money. You need money, you need wealth. That's so important.
Mm.
Um, it's just reinforced into us over and over again. But nobody's like, oh, you should appreciate things that aren't money. That's just like nobody gives that advice because it seems obvious and it seems crazy to tell anyone that.
Yeah, yeah. No, and also the previous generation had that kind of lifestyle. I grew up in a household where my mom had to support other family with taking. She was a teacher, and while and working in a government school, and she had to take additional tuitions and classes to support the family. And I'm sure at that, and I'm sure so the truth that she found discovered in her own life was that money is the important thing. But
Yeah.
what I'm trying to say in a certain sense is that life as we now the next generation comes in, that it is important for us to also re-examine and see what roles we play and constantly re-evaluate these things.
Yeah, I think there are more options than ever, but if you choose to believe that money is the most important thing, it certainly will be.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And I'm not writing for those people. I think what I discovered in my process is like I'm writing for the weirdos, the dreamers, the people that want to imagine, the people that want to learn how to take different paths, that want to experiment, that want to create space in their life. Um, so yeah, I don't really know how to be somebody that like fits in really well. I tried it and like struggled for years.
I too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a great time. I think John Stuart Mill was writing about like experiments in living. I think the 1800s, and he was basically just saying that like this is one of the most vital things we can do because there are plenty of people that fit in, but the people that bear the cost for that are the weirdos, the creative people, the rebels. And one of the most important things we can do is like have them be experimenting as much as possible because they're going to discover new ways of living, new ways of orienting to the world. Um, and I think like that's more possible than ever, but more people are just saying like, now too scary. Don't want to
Yeah,
do it.
yeah. No, and I think I often get these comments from people, and they tell me about should I now quit the job, and I've received these comments also from few friends, and I tell them that uh, it's perhaps good to quit when quitting is the most obvious thing to do, rather than quitting being the most
Yeah.
scariest thing to do.
Yeah. It's also, if they're asking you, they're probably not wired for it. What I've found is the people that are going to quit just go do it.
Mm.
Like it may take them several years to get to that point, but like they're headed in that direction. They're like going
Yeah.
towards it. The people that are like, should I work on my own? Should I not work on my own? What they really want is a break.
Mm.
They want 1 month off of like disconnecting from being in nonstop worker or school mode for most of their life.
Mm.
And they want to go sit by the beach or the countryside and contemplate like what they really want out of their life. You can't do that on a vacation. You can't do that on a weekend. You need like a month off.
Mm. Yeah, I think differentiating that is very crucial, because we operate also in these binaries, right? Either I'm in full worker mode or I'm in vacation mode,
Yeah,
and it's so hard to break through that binary and think of another alternative. I mean, it's almost like the middle path in some sense.
for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Wonderful. I think I really love this conversation. You know, thank you for really sharing this. You know, I mean, growing up, you know, we read these. I mean, I've read many books from American authors, and you know, and there's a certain conception of there is that everything is figured out, right? And your answer anxieties are a problem to be resolved, and this is how you do it. And there's almost this nature of this kind of these books. I mean, when you read a lot of American books, you get this notion that, especially those kind that you know that this is the solution you have to go. And it's so heartwarming to kind of come up with a book that says that, you know, I don't have the solution, I'm figuring out, I'm still experimenting, and so do you. You have no other choice. And thank you for taking that courage to do that work. And I think that's what really resonates, that because in some ways nobody has any of these answers. I
Yeah.
often, we pretend, you know, sometimes that this is a solution, and you have to wake up to again realize that, you know, your angst is still real.
Yeah, that's cool to hear. I intentionally did not give any answers.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, I don't know how to do that. I also used to work in strategy consulting, and I know how to like manufacture. I could have done it. I
yeah.
know
Right,
I like
menonym,
could have
four-letter
wrote like
menonym. Yeah,
yeah, I could have wrote like a framework and created something really compelling and added like 75 pages to the book, but it would have been nonsense and bullshit. Um, the truth is, like, everyone's got to figure out their own framework and principles and strategies for their life. Can they steal, remix, and borrow from my story? Probably. Um, but it's going to be their own unique path. And
yeah,
going back to Joseph Campbell, like, that is the essence of what he talked about. Is like, you need to find your one true path.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's where the, you know, the hero's journey also comes in, right? The earlier hero's journey was, you ventured out into outer world, different worlds, and then you came back as a whole new person. I guess now, probably, you know, book like yours, sh- to me, showed me a glimmer of possibility of a new hero's journey, where even if you don't go anywhere and come back as a new person, you go and go deep inside and figure out whom you want to be, and then explore
Yeah.
outside the world. You know,
Yeah. I
you don't have
haven't
to depend
looked
on
at
going outside the world to figure out your own story.
Yeah, I need to figure out how well my story maps to the hero's journey. I haven't really looked, but yeah, it's definitely a remix on it, I think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I'm, you know, trying to. I'm in the process of writing a book that looks at uh, the climate change realities, uh, and how does one examine living a meaningful life in the wake of climate change realities in the future. So that's been my book that I'm trying to write. That, you know, today the data is obvious, right? In few years down the line, in 10-15 years down the line, you know the kind of impacts climate change is
Yeah,
gonna wreak on our lives. uh, in that, given that, you know, the sort of fatalistic future scenario that you have, how do you then live a life of meaning? uh,
I like
so
that.
so that's been my exploration, and I find your book a very core part of that, in terms of uh, moving past our addiction to our earlier work, and trying to really recreate a new conception of work in that.
That's awesome. I'm excited to see how your book does too.
Thank you, and thank you for taking the time. And I don't want to stretch more. It's almost an hour, and you go to bed, and hopefully
Awesome.
excited to follow your journey, and I'm sure, I hope those who've listened in and tuned in were also able to get something precious out of this and discover their own pathless path. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for
Yeah.
doing this.
People are interested in the book, they can check it out.
Yeah, I'll post
Um,
a link to the
if
book in the
people
comments there. Yeah,
if people can't afford it, they can email me and I'm happy to gift it to them as well. So
great,
just send me a message. But yeah, love hearing from people and their stories about how they're taking different paths in the world.
wonderful, wonderful. So am I, and thank you so much for taking the time, Paul.
Awesome. Thanks, Venki.
Thank you.